I'm doing a review for this book. It's The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. To write a book as brilliantly as this, on such a horrific subject, and with this much humour, takes incredible talent. And that is what Solzhenitsyn brings to this factual, investigative report on the workings of the Soviet Russian prison system, with a focus on political prisoners. Political prisoners are anyone who says anything against the government. Like anything. This book was excellent. I've learnt lots about the Soviet Union, the depths of human depravity, and the lengths people will go to survive. And we haven't even got to the camps yet. I have read volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago because I wanted the unabridged version. That's me, terrified I might miss something I should know. Therefore, I still have the other 2 volumes to read, so you know what's on my Christmas list. The Bolsheviks came to power in 1917 and the violence began straight away. The Gulag Archipelago was published in the 70s and it catalogues decades of violence and abuse against the people who lived in the Soviet Union. It tells the story of the prison system, including holding prisons, interrogation prisons, transport prisons, and labour camps. They were spread throughout the land and were often in the same towns and cities that normal life carried on outside the prison walls. If you are in any doubt as to where too much power in the hands of a few leads, then you need to wake up and read some history. And if you believe that your leaders are benevolent and care about your well-being and that they won't pack you off to slave camps and have you murdered, if it benefits them, then read some history. In volume 1, Solzhenitsyn runs through the arrest and detention process for a political prisoner in typical chronological order of experience, starting with the arrest and then going through the interrogation and sentencing. There are also sections on the law and how it has developed to the way it is in the mid-20th century. Then there is the transportation to labour camps and the transit prisons along the way. Solzhenitsyn has written this book using many personal testimonies as well as past media reports and historical records. Although official records were kept by the Soviet state regarding political prisoners, their arrests and transportation, these records either no longer exist or had not been released by the state when this book was written. This means there is a lot that is not known. Solzhenitsyn references a case which involved 30 secondary school teachers and the head of the provincial education department. Of the teachers, 5 of them died before trial from tortures suffered during interrogation. 24 died in camps. The 30th returned after his release and rehabilitation. Had he died, we would have known nothing about the 30, just as we know nothing about the millions of others. There is deception at every stage, starting with the initial arrest. There are casual, quiet, daytime arrests when someone is asked into an office, into a car or an alleyway. They are then arrested and led away under guard. For several decades, political arrests were distinguished in our country precisely by the fact that people were arrested who were guilty of nothing and were therefore unprepared to put up any resistance whatsoever. A submissive sheep is a find for a wolf. There were also arrests carried out with terror in order to throw the person off guard. The kind of night arrest described is, in fact, a favourite because it has important advantages. Everyone living in the apartment is thrown into a state of terror by the first knock at the door. The arrested person is torn from the warmth of his bed, he is in a daze, half asleep, helpless, and his judgment is befogged. In a night arrest, the state security men have a superiority in numbers. There are many of them, armed against one person who hasn't even finished buttoning up his trousers. There were also mass arrests, such as the many people returning after World War II. Of course, every machine has a point at which it is overloaded, beyond which it cannot function. In the strained and overloaded years of 1945 and 1946, when trainload after trainload poured in from Europe to be swallowed up immediately and sent off to Gulag, all that excessive theatricality went out the window, and the whole theory suffered greatly. All the fuss and feathers of ritual went flying in every direction, and the arrest of tens of thousands took on the appearance of a squalid roll call. They stood there with lists, read off the names of those on one train, loaded them onto another, and that was the whole arrest. Most people arrested did little to resist. They reasoned that they had done nothing to incur any serious punishment. Since you aren't guilty, then how can they arrest you? It's a mistake. They are already dragging you along by the collar, and you still keep on exclaiming to yourself, it's a mistake. They'll set things straight and let me out. Others are being arrested en masse, and that's a bothersome fact. But in those other cases, there is always some dark area. Maybe he was guilty. But as for you, you are obviously innocent. But in reality, the arrest was often a civilized start to a future of brutality. My cellmates had educated me in the deceptions practiced by the interrogators, their threats and beatings, in the fact that once a person was arrested, he was never released. Even religious people were not safe from the tyranny. In the 1920s, the religious education of children was classified as a political crime under Article 5810 of the Code. In other words, counter-revolutionary propaganda. Bishops were arrested, and as always in the wake of the big fish, followed shoals of smaller fry, archpriests, monks and deacons. These arrests were not even reported in the press. Any justification was needed for arrests, however ridiculous. Therefore, terms such as limiter or wrecker were used to lay the blame for the failures of the Soviet state on anyone other than themselves. Anyone who questions that the unmeetable targets would be reached, anyone who doesn't reach them, anyone who dares to complain. Please note that the following quote contains sarcasm. Nikolai Karlovich von Meck of the People's Commissariat of Railroads pretended to be terribly devoted to the development of the new economy, and he loved to give advice. One such pernicious piece of advice was to increase the size of freight trains and not worry about heavier than average loads. The GPU exposed von Meck and he was shot. His objective had been to wear out the rails and roadbeds, freight cars and locomotives, so as to leave the Republic without railroads in case of foreign military intervention. When, not long afterward, the new People's Commissar of Railroads, Comrade Kaganovich, ordered that average loads should be increased, and even doubled and tripled them, and for this discovery received the Order of Lenin along with others of our leaders. The malicious engineers who protested became known as limiters. They raised the outcry that this was too much and would result in the breakdown of the rolling stock, and they were rightly shot for their lack of faith in the possibilities of socialist transport. 6 geologists were sentenced to 10 years under 58.7 for intentionally concealing reserves of tin ore in underground sites in anticipation of the arrival of the Germans. In other words, they had failed to find the deposits. Not only were many members of the public arrested, more surprising was how many members of the ruling party were arrested, and high-up members too. It seemed that in this paranoid atmosphere, no one was safe. Here is one vignette from those years as it actually occurred. A district party conference was underway in Moscow province. It was presided over by a new secretary of the district party committee, replacing one recently arrested. At the conclusion of the conference, a tribute to Comrade Stalin was called for. Of course, everyone stood up, just as everyone had leapt to his feet during the conference at every mention of his name. The small hall echoed with stormy applause rising to an ovation. For 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, The stormy applause rising to an ovation continued. But palms were getting sore and raised arms were already aching, and the older people were panting from exhaustion. It was becoming insufferably silly even to those who really adore Stalin. However, who would dare to be the first to stop? The secretary of the district party committee could have done it. He was standing on the platform and it was he who had just called for the ovation. But he was a newcomer. He had taken the place of a man who'd been arrested. He was afraid. After all, NKVD men were standing in the hall applauding and watching to see who quit first. And in that obscure, small hall, unknown to the leader, the applause went on. 6, 7, 8 minutes. The director of the local paper factory, an independent and strong-minded man, stood with the presidium, aware of all the falsity and all the impossibility of the situation. He still kept on applauding. 9 minutes. 10. In anguish, he watched the secretary of the district party committee, but the latter did not stop. Insanity to the last man. With make-believe enthusiasm on their faces, looking at each other with faint hope. The district leaders were just going to go on and on applauding till they fell where they stood, till they were carried out of the hall on stretchers. Then, after 11 minutes, the director of the paper factory assumed a businesslike expression and sat down in his seat. And oh, a miracle took place. Where had the universal, uninhibited, indescribable enthusiasm gone? To a man, everyone else stopped dead and sat down. They had been saved. The squirrel had been smart enough to jump off the revolving wheel. That, however, was how they discovered who the independent people were, and that was how they went about eliminating them. That same night, the factory director was arrested. His interrogator reminded him, "Don't ever be the first to stop applauding." And that's also how to grind people down with stupidity. There are parallels between the Russian Blue Caps and the German Nazis. There is no way of sidestepping this comparison. Both the years and the methods coincide too closely. And the comparison occurred even more naturally to those who had passed through the hands of both the Gestapo and the MGB. Divnich was tortured by both, but the Gestapo was nonetheless trying to get at the truth, and when the accusation did not hold up, Divnich was released. The MGB wasn't interested in the truth and had no intention of letting anyone out of its grip once he was arrested. "Just give us a person and we'll create the case." That was what many of them said jokingly, and it was their slogan. The Blue Caps' power was explained well, including their power over women. The level of power given to the Blue Caps was perverse. They could go anywhere, take anything, and get away with anything. It's a situation that fuels cruel and depraved behaviour. The passion for gain was their universal passion. After all, in the absence of any checking up, such power was inevitably used for personal enrichment. One would have had to be holy to refrain. The Russian soldiers who were taken prisoner by the enemy during World War II were left to starve in the prison camps. I didn't know that the POWs had to be fed by the country they had come from, but apparently this was so. The Soviet Union didn't pay for them to be fed. Solzhenitsyn discussed how many prisoners of war in Germany became spies. Almost always these opportunities were taken so that they could live and also to get back to their motherland. There were also some POWs who were genuinely happy to fight alongside the Germans against the tyrannical Russian power. And there was even the rare, genuine spy. Solzhenitsyn explains how almost all the Russian prisoners of war wanted to get back to their motherland. When they were liberated, they were arrested by the Soviets and sent to labour camps. It seems inconceivable that so many returning soldiers and released prisoners were arrested, yet it was so. Solzhenitsyn was arrested himself near the end of World War II and states that victory was not for us. The only soldier in the world who cannot surrender is the soldier of the world's one and only Red Army. That's what it says in our military statutes. There is war, there is death, but there is no surrender. On the arrest and or shooting of returned prisoners of war, Solzhenitsyn says, incidentally, it is very naive to say, what for? At no time have governments been moralists. They never imprisoned people and executed them for having done something. They imprisoned and executed them to keep them from doing something. They imprisoned all these POWs, of course, not for treason to the motherland. They imprisoned all of them to keep them from telling their fellow villagers about Europe. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't grieve for. Even the prisoners struggled to believe what was happening. We saw that millions of us prisoners were flowing past and knew that millions more would greet us in the camps. It just couldn't be that so many people were to remain in prison after the greatest victory in the world. It was just to frighten us that they were holding us for the time being, so that we might remember and take heed. Of course, there would soon be a total amnesty and all of us would be released. We brushed aside those wise individuals among us who explained that millions of us were imprisoned precisely because the war had ended. We were no longer needed at the front. We were dangerous in the rear. And if it were not for us, not one brick would ever get laid at the remote construction projects. When discussing the development of the law, Solzhenitsyn discusses and references the show trials of the 1920s. During this period, Russia was in a state of civil unrest. There was also famine, which was probably caused by the reorganisations imposed by the new government. 1921 was the most difficult of all the 4 winters of the Civil War. Nothing was left for fuel, and trains simply couldn't get to the next station, and there were cold and famine in the capitals. Who was to blame? That was a famous question. Who is to blame? Well, obviously not the overall leadership, and not even the local leadership. That was important. In this particular case, it was decided to be the fault of the engineers of the main fuel committee. It was their calculations that were to blame. For the engineers, there was no way out. They were damned if they did and damned if they didn't. If they went forward, it was wrong. And if they went backward, it was wrong too. If they hurried, they were hurrying for the purpose of wrecking. If they moved methodically, it meant wrecking by slowing down tempos. And so it went on. Solzhenitsyn gives details of a number of cases which highlight how ludicrous the reasoning of allegations and convictions were. You wouldn't believe it could happen. Trials were staged, defendants were briefed to admit to whatever they were told to admit to. Some people did resist. Many people were tortured to death during interrogation. But the show trials still had enough actors prepared to repeat whatever lines they were told to. How were they worked over? Very simply, do you want to live? And even those who don't care about themselves care about their children or grandchildren. Occasionally, people did use these opportunities to attempt to expose the truth. People did try, but it was unsuccessful. They got rid of the trials altogether in the end. Later, the verdicts were decided by a small private group who looked through the paperwork. We hadn't been there. We hadn't seen it. All we got was a piece of paper. Sign here. The governing forces also pressed on with disempowering the church. During the famines, the churches were already collecting funds to help feed the starving. But to have permitted any direct help to go straight from the church into the mouths of those who were starving would have undermined the dictatorship of the proletariat. The committees were banned. The state proposed that the church hand over all its valuables, other than those used for liturgical rites. The patriarch agreed. A decree followed that all valuables were to be requisitioned, including those used for liturgical rites. The patriarch responded that, from the church's point of view, such a measure was sacrilege and they could not approve the requisition. A propaganda campaign against the church was enacted, eventually the church volunteered to give over all their valuables, stating that it saw sacrilege only in forced requisition. If they volunteered their valuables, that would be acceptable. But this did not please the state. Again, things were getting fouled up with some kind of compromise. The nauseous fumes of Christianity were poisoning the revolutionary will. That kind of unity and that way of handing over the valuables were not what the starving people of the Volga needed. And so forcible requisitions accompanied by strife began in Petrograd, as they did everywhere else. And this provided the legal basis for initiating trials of the clergy. I mean, for fuck's sake. And this happened in the last century. Archpriest A.N. Zalzhesky had surrendered all the valuables in his own church, but he defended in principle the Patriarch's appeal regarding forced requisition as sacrilege, and he became the central personage in the trial and would shortly be shot. All of which went to prove that what was important was not to feed the starving, but to make use of a convenient opportunity to break the back of the church. Religious buildings were also used as prisons. How immoral. The descriptions of the conditions and overcrowding in the cells and the prisoner transports bore similarities with stories I've read from people who have been in concentration camps, and they never stop shocking me. The claustrophobic atmosphere described always feels very personal. I can't imagine being able to bear being shoved up and intermingled with masses of people all the fucking time. I think I would go mad. This quote refers to people who had been sentenced to death. Into a cell intended for solitary confinement, they would shove 7, never fewer, sometimes 10, 15, even 28 prisoners awaiting execution. And they remained packed in this way for weeks or even months. Prisoners were transported between prison and labour camps in various ways. There was by rail, in customised Stolypin cars, which were often hooked onto the back of regular passenger trains, or in wooden cattle carriages. On road they were crowded into Black Maria vans, and at times the prisoners were made to march on foot. The Stolypin cars were used to transport prisoners all over the country, and the prisoners were stuffed into them. 2 huddle half-sitting on each of the upper baggage shelves. Another 5 lie on the joined middle level, and this leaves 13 down below. 5 sit on each of the 2 bunks, and 3 are in the aisle between their legs. In this section, we also learn more about the Underworld Thieves, who are frankly fucking frightening. They were hardened career criminals. You see cruel, loathsome snouts up there, wearing expressions of greed and mockery. Each of them looks at you like a spider gloating over a fly. Their sinewy purple necks, their swelling shoulder muscles, their swarthy tattooed chests have never suffered prison emaciation. Who are they? Where do they come from? In one moment, all the customs and habits of human intercourse you have lived with all your life have broken down. From that moment, nothing that belongs to you is yours any longer. They terrorised and robbed the other prisoners, who were generally easy pickings for these brutal thieves. The stolen property was traded between the thieves and the guards, and the thieves were given preferential treatment because it was the political prisoners who were considered the absolute scum. There was a particularly upsetting story about a young woman who was attacked by the thieves in a Black Maria. That morning she had been a free woman. She was on trial for leaving her work without official permission, a likely fabricated charge. She was sentenced to 5 years. Half an hour later, in a Black Maria, she was gang raped by the Underworld Thieves, whilst the political prisoners, ground down by their own experiences, did nothing to help her. And thief tenderness too. Having raped her, they robbed her. They took the fashionable shoes with which she had hoped to charm the judges and her blouse, which they shoved through to the convoy guards, who stopped the van and went off to get some vodka and handed it in so the thieves could drink at her expense too. It's enough to push a person to lose all hope in humanity. And at the transit prisons, there were 100 of us in a cell a little larger than the average room in an apartment. And we were packed in, and you couldn't find a place on the floor for your feet. And 2 little windows on the south side were blocked with muzzles made of steel sheets. They not only kept the air from circulating, but they got very hot from the sun and radiated heat into the cell. The transit prison conditions were diabolical, to the point of distributing the gruel in wash basins for 10 people at a time, leaving them to race each other gulping it down. How inhumane. During the years when the prisoners' cases didn't carry any indication of their final destination, the transit prisons turned into slave markets. The most desired guests at the transit prisons were the buyers. The conscientious merchants demanded that the merchandise be displayed alive and bare-skinned for them to inspect. Many people died in the disgusting conditions of the cattle carriages that they were transported to Northern Territories in. I'm not going to read out a quote of that because I personally find it too awful to repeat the words. It's beyond inhuman. That's not to say that I don't greatly appreciate Solzhenitsyn's work highlighting the facts. There are countless horrific tales, all of which should never have taken place. But there may be little sympathy for individual victims, as Solzhenitsyn comments, if you live in a graveyard, you can't weep for everyone. Amongst all the horror described in the Gulag Archipelago, something that stands out is the amazing amount of humour. It's an aggressive humour, and Solzhenitsyn can be incredibly sarcastic. I wouldn't want to be on the receiving end of it. Reading it is excellent, though. Solzhenitsyn rips apart the ludicrous facade of the governing forces' justifications for their atrocious behaviour. With humour, Solzhenitsyn exposes the rules as the joke that they are. To be able to read something that makes you want to cry or rage about, but instead to be laughing out loud because of the excellent humour, it is the tonic needed to cope with the subject matter. This book was less of a personal memoir and more of an in-depth piece of investigative journalism, with an incredible amount of excellent information, including personal testimonials and historical data in forms of law, press stories and historical information. It should be made very clear that the things described by Solzhenitsyn, and I don't believe he's making them up, about the Soviet government's plans and their implementation, that the whole thing is insane, actually insane. We're talking about incompetent, paranoid lunatics in charge and lazy, cruel idiots carrying out their orders in immoral work mode. We're talking about there being no food because they have arrested so many of the farm workers or the food processors. We're talking about people going out of their way to get bread to starving people, and then that person being arrested for going against the state orders. And let's talk about the scale of the arrests. It is insane. To begin with, when I was reading this book, I kept thinking, but they're arresting so many people. It's ridiculous. Surely the cost of imprisoning them all will bankrupt the state. Yes, I am that naive. Of course, the prisoners are to be sent to labour camps to build the infrastructure for the Soviet Union. They are basically slave labour, and most of them will die from the appalling conditions. So arrest away. You wouldn't believe it's true. You just wouldn't believe that it happened in the last century, and yet it did. This book also feels important because of the way the world is heading right now. I've seen the disconnect between the COVID facts and the response, and I've thought, this is insane. The demands that are being placed upon us and our behaviour by people who follow no rules is immoral. And I can't help feeling that unless people fight for their rights, this is where we're headed. I'm not a crazy conspiracy theorist. I've just read my history, and this is where it leads. Read the book. For fuck's sake, read the book. This isn't fiction. It isn't ancient history. This is what has happened in the last century when governing bodies have been given absolute control over people's lives. It always ends in tyranny. It always ends in lies so big people can't believe anyone would really lie like that. It always ends in taking away our freedom, and it always ends in murder. And for anyone who asks, yeah, but why? Why would they do that? Why do you think they're doing it? Honest answers now. Why are power-obsessed people lying to us and taking away our freedom? You really need to ask? Humans have been intoxicated by the abuse of power over other people since the dawn of civilization. They lie for it, they kill for it, they will do anything you can or can't imagine for it. Why would you think that our leaders are not the same as the others who have come before? Just read the fucking book, because this is where we're heading if we don't stand up to tyranny while we still can. And if I'm wrong, if I'm just totally wrong, and actually our leaders are honest and benevolent and caring, and they really do have our best interests at heart, then hey, fucking hallelujah. But if I'm right, do not say that you were not warned. Never say that you didn't know where it could lead. Okay, so thank you. Now the next book I'm going to be reading is this massive book, Paradise Lost by Milton. So please look out for that one. Okay, thank you.